Hello and welcome to Moja Kuchnia, my kitchen. This is going to be a blog about baking, and this is going to be Baking 101 today, cookies, starting with the chocolate chip cookie, the basic cookie everybody should learn. First, let me tell you who I am. My name is Samantha. I am a pastry student set to graduate sometime. With this COVID going on, and classes have been a little more difficult to take. I'm also the mother of 2 adult children, 3 wonderful dogs. Okay, so today, like I said, we're going to make chocolate chip cookies. You'll be able to find the recipe in the comments. This was originally a recipe from my grandmother, who I believe got it from Nestle Toll House originally, and both of us have made changes to it since. The first thing you're going to do before you do anything else always is wash your hands. And you don't want to use scented soap because scented soap can actually contaminate your food because the fragrance can get into your food. So you're going to wash your hands even before you touch your items. Now I've already pulled everything, but the first thing we're going to do is get all the equipment you're going to need. And you always want to do that first so that you're not trying to get things out while you're working. So the equipment, again, the products you see me use, the hand mixer, I will have links to the products in the comments as well. The equipment we're going to need today is a hand mixer with regular beaters. So we're going to go ahead and put those in. All right. We're going to need a person who can put the beaters in. We're going to need a mixing bowl, a separate bowl to put the dry ingredients in, a sifter for the dry ingredients not to include sugar for this particular recipe. I prefer this kind of sifter. You can use the hand crank. They have different kinds. This is the one I prefer to use. We're going to need a rubber spatula, and we're going to need a spatula to remove the cookies from the rack. I prefer an offset spatula for that, but you can use any kind. You're going to need, for this recipe, a butter knife to slice the butter. And I use the second one that I keep clean to level off my spoons and my measuring cups. We're going to need appropriate measuring cups and measuring spoons. This recipe calls for eggs, so I will have a bowl so I can crack the egg into the bowl and then put it in the recipe. Now, for cakes, it's important to add 1 egg at a time. Not so much for these cookies, but you always want to crack your eggs in a separate bowl because if there's something wrong with the egg and you do it right into your recipe, you'll ruin your recipe. We're also going to need a pair of scissors, particularly for this recipe because I have to open the chocolate chips. We're going to need a cookie scoop. Now, I love this one. I do have another one that I got that's just all metal, but I like this one because they came in a set of 3. So it also has the cupcake scoop, and then one you can use either for ice cream or if you're dividing cake batter, you know you can do it scoop by scoop and get it exact. So we'll put those aside because we only need the cookie scoop for this recipe. We will also need rubber gloves, because anytime you touch the food after it comes out of the oven for the final time, if you're not making it just for your house or you have a cut of some kind, you want to have gloves on. If you have a cut or a burn or a rash of some sort, you want to wear gloves the entire time you're touching anything to do with the food. We'll need a paper towel and some baking spray for our cookie scoop. We're going to need racks to cool our cookies. And that will be these. They stand up like this. So let's set those aside for when we need them. The next thing we're going to need is cookie sheets. I use the half sheet pans so I can use them for cake or cookies. You can use a regular cookie sheet. And a lot of recipes say grease your pan. You can put spray on here. You can butter it and flour it. It's a mess to clean up. You have other options. You can get what I like to use for cookies, which is a silicone mat. It's called a Silpat. They do have other brands. And they fit right in. You scoop your cookie right off, You don't even have to wash the pan, just rinse off the Silpat. I like the Silpat for cookies because you won't get a crispy cookie on it. Any cookies baked on Silpat will always be those soft cookies. I prefer soft cookies, so I always use the Silpat. If you prefer a crunchy cookie, you can use parchment squares, or you can get this in a roll where you measure it out and cut it off like you would tin foil. And they look like this. These are the pre-cut squares. You can get them in white, which is the bleach. The only difference is it didn't undergo another chemical process. Or like I said, you can get the roll and you pull it off the roll and cut it and measure it to your pan just like you would with your tin foil in your pan. Now that'll give you a crisper cookie. It gives you the same type of result as if you had just greased the pan. Now I always get out one or so more cookie sheets than I think I'm gonna need. And the reason we do that is because we don't want, in the middle of our recipe, and we're getting cookies ready and we're getting stuff to go in the oven, to have to run into the other room and get something we need. It's a lot easier to put it away unused than it is to fetch it in the middle of baking. Now once I get all of that together, I make sure, and in this case I've read the recipe already, but you want to make sure you pre-read your recipe every single step. And the reason you want to do that is because there are some recipes that are not written specifically in order, so you'll get halfway through and it'll say, now that you've done this, and you haven't done that yet. So this way you know everything you're gonna need, you know how they want you to do it, what order, and that way it's a little easier to when you reference that recipe while you're cooking to get your cookies done. The next thing I always do is pull all my ingredients. Depending on the type of recipe, I may put stuff in a bunch of little bowls. It does create a little more dishes to clean, but everything's right at hand. You can just mix through your recipe, get it in the oven, do your cleanup. If you forgot something, it's very easy to see what you have forgotten, and it helps eliminate some mistakes. Now for this recipe, we're gonna need a cup of butter, which is 2 sticks. I always use unsalted. However, if you use salted butter, you need to cut salt out of the recipe. Now these need to be room temperature as well as the eggs. You always want all your ingredients to be room temperature unless the recipe states otherwise. Now if you have forgotten to take your butter and eggs out a couple hours before or the night before, depending, there's a quick, easy way to room temperature them up. You take your butter, put it in the microwave. If you're using ones that are whole sticks, you put the opening side up first, and we do this in 5-second increments because you don't want the butter to melt or start to melt. It changes the butter's composition, which changes the composition of your recipe, which will change your cookie's outcome. Okay, so you just want it soft and squishy, not melted. So after you do the first 5, if it's not soft, you want to rotate it from having this up to having this on one of the sides. Now, if your recipe doesn't call for enough butter, that you're going to be using a whole stick, what you want to do is you want to put your butter in a microwavable bowl and do the same thing every 5 seconds. However, if your microwave doesn't rotate on its own, after every 5 seconds, you're going to want to rotate your bowl a 1/4 turn. So we've got our stick of butter. It calls for a 1/2 cup of sugar. Now, having read the recipe prior to starting, I know I'm going to cream the butter and sugars. So I'm going to go ahead and put them directly into my mixing bowl. So we're going to start with our 1/2 cup of sugar. Now, the reason I didn't put the butter in first is I always like to put the sugars at the bottom so that when you start mixing, you don't end up with sugar all over the place because it is lightweight, and that would normally be what would happen to me. So now I keep my sugar and flour in airtight containers, which is really important if you live in a high humid area, with a scoop. So we need a 1/2 cup. I'm going to pull my 1/2 cup out, and I'm going to show you how we measure. This is why we want a clean knife that's not going to have butter on it. Because we're going to take our scoop, and if you don't have a scoop, you're going to want to use a serving spoon, and you just pour the sugar in until it sort of towers over. And if you have clumps, just knock them out, because sometimes you get clumpy with sugar, and it doesn't matter in this recipe. You pour it in, You take the back of your knife. I always go back to the handle and then go forward so that you get a nice level without packed in things. So I always bring it back to the handle and then forward, taking off the excess. So I'm gonna go ahead and put my 1/2 cup of sugar in there. I like to continuously refer back to my recipe because I tend to leave ingredients out if I don't. So we've got that. Now we are done with our sugar. So I'm gonna close it up and set it completely out of my way to be put away. Now we're gonna do our brown sugar. Again, airtight container. Brown sugar tends to clump up. You can put a piece of bread in with it to help that suck the moisture out so it doesn't clump. I keep it in the airtight box with a clip and I just give it a good wiggle before I start. Now, brown sugar is different than everything else we scoop, and we're gonna need 3/4 of a cup of it. Brown sugar needs to be packed, and I'll show you what that means. Unlike that, you're gonna push the sugar into your measure cup, you're gonna pack it down so that it's completely packed in, like you can't fit any more. Once it's packed in, you're gonna dump it out, and what you should have, knowing you packed it well, is a little round shape from your measure cup. Now that's our 1/2 cup. Now we're gonna go ahead and put the other 1/4 cup in, and we're gonna do the same thing. We're gonna pack it down. Now remember I said before we only need the gloves if we have a cut or a rash or a burn. And you can see I'm touching things with my bare hands because everything is still going to go into the oven. And I'm just going to reiterate, once it comes out of the oven, if this food is not for the people in your house, your family members, you want to make sure you have gloves on. Alrighty, now we're going to put the butter in because we're going to cream it. Now you could dump your whole stick in and it'll work just fine. It's a little harder to mix in, especially with a hand mixer. But even with my stand mixer, I always just chunk up the butter. That's why I said we needed 2 butter knives. Because now this one isn't clean to use for our measuring. Now I'm just gonna scrape all that aside. So we have all that butter in. Then we're gonna go ahead and do the second one. So we get our whole cup. And the sticks of butter will give you measurements on the side. The simple measurement is 1 tablespoon of butter, or 1 stick of butter out of the common butter is 4 ounces. So each tablespoon is 1/2 ounce of butter. All right, once that is done, I'm gonna actually keep my paper out and set it aside because I'm gonna go ahead and put my eggshells on there so that I don't mess up the counter too much. Okay, now I'm going to set that aside since we're just pulling ingredients right now. We're going to continue on with our ingredients. We have our eggs. Now, if you forgot to pull your eggs out a couple hours before you're ready to bake and they still feel cold, there's a simple way to room temperature these guys up as well. Get a bowl that's big enough for the amount of eggs you're using for your recipe, and tall enough that you can bring the water so it fully covers the eggs. Run your faucet on hot, as hot as it gets. Fill your bowl, set it aside. By the time you're ready to incorporate your eggs, they'll be room temperature. Now, if you have to room temperature your butter and eggs, you want to do that right before you even get the rest of your equipment out. Do that first so that they have time to be properly room temperature. All right, so we have our 2 eggs. The first thing we need is going to be a teaspoon of baking powder, which is going to be our leavening in this one. We won't have any baking powder. We're relying on the baking soda. So we're going to go ahead and take our teaspoon. Now, if your recipe calls for teaspoons and cups such as this one, that means it's by volume. If the recipe is by volume, do the entire recipe by volume. If it tells you 8 ounces of flour, do it by weight, which is what that is. If it's in ounces, grams, liters, it's by weight. If it starts out by weight, do the entire recipe by weight. And the reason you always want to make sure you do that is if your recipe calls for a cup of flour, you go, okay, a cup's 8 ounces. I'll measure 8 ounces of flour. A cup of flour is only about 4.5 ounces because it's by the volume of flour, not the weight. So always remember, if it's by volume, which is with cups and spoons, cups and teaspoons, tablespoons, or fluid ounces, you're going to want to do it by volume the whole way through. Okay, so we're going to take our teaspoon, go in our baking powder, and we're going to take the back of our clean knife the same way we did for the sugar. And I'm going to switch hands because I'm right-handed. And we're going to level our teaspoon so we get the right amount of leavening. Too much leavening will have things grow out of proportion. With cupcakes, if you put too much leavening in, they will blow up in the oven. And it is a mess to clean up. We're going to sift it through. The next thing we need is a teaspoon of salt. Now, I'm going to be using pink salt. You can use your regular iodized white table salt. And if you do, when you sift your salt, you won't find that anything is left, or anything that isn't a clump is left over. With the Himalayan salt, which we're going to use a teaspoon of, I'm going to have kernels of salt left over. And that's because it's a chunkier salt. So what I'm going to do once I sift it is check and make sure the granules in my salt are the granules I want and dump them in. Alrighty. The next thing our recipe calls for is 2 1/4 cups of flour. And we're going to do the flour just like we did the sugar. Again, my airtight container. And we're going to take and it's very important with flour not to pack it in, because too much flour, your cookies won't taste right, they'll bubble up, they won't mix right, they won't have the right texture. Again, you want to get it so that it's nice and over full. Bring this to the forefront. And we're going to take our knife again. We're going to make sure we come back all the way to the handle and then just scrape without hurting it. Now I have a big enough sifter that I'm going to go ahead and put all the flour right into the sifter. If you have a smaller one, you can do it measure by measure. That's why I like to use a bigger one, because I can get it all done at once. So we're going to go ahead and go right across there, dump that in. And then we're going to grab our 1/4 cup and do again the same thing. We do them all the same way. Make sure it's to the handle, scrape off the excess. And I'm going to put aside things I know I don't need anymore, because a clean work area is a good work area. The more you can clean as you go, the better. I'm going to get us a clean paper towel to wipe all that excess off of there. I tend to get flour everywhere. Some people don't. I'm afflicted with that. So we're going to take it and we're going to sift it. Now, if your bowl is big enough like this one, and that you can hang your sifter in, you can do this. And what this does is make it so the flour doesn't shoot around. You do less of the work. You can also hold it, hit it with your hand. Make sure you keep it tilted so that what's coming out of the sifter stays below the top of the bowl you're using. Otherwise, you're just going to be sifting it out onto your counter. Once you get everything sifted, anything hard left in there, you're going to just want to dump out. And that is part of why we sift our flour, that in case there's something funky in your flour that you couldn't see when you dumped it in, then you'll know either the flour's no good or that you don't want to use it. Now I'm going to go ahead and take my spatula and stir my dry ingredients, because while we sifted everything into one bowl, they're not mixed together. The flour went in on top of the other two. So you want to give it a good mix so that everything gets fully incorporated. All right, now here's our chocolate chips. I'm going to use mini chips today. This calls for 1 to 2 cups. Now these are Enjoy Life vegan mini chips. Discovered these by accident. Doing something for Christmas, they didn't have mini chips. I needed mini chips. They had these. I gave them a try. They tasted just like regular chips. So I'm going to go ahead and use them again. However, while it calls for chips, you can use regular sized chocolate chips, dark chips, semi-sweet, peanut butter chips, caramel chips, mint chips, white chocolate chips. You can also add nuts, whatever kind you like, chopped up in. You can use chocolate chunk. You can use M&Ms, Reese's Pieces. You can put raisins. I'm not sure why you want raisins in your food. If you're not a chocolate person, you can do just raisins, just nuts, raisins, nuts. If you leave them plain, what you get is a brown sugar cookie, which are really good in and of themselves. Make sure these aren't sitting on your stove because our first step to the recipe is to preheat the oven and we don't want to melt our chocolate chips. So we're going to put our dry ingredients to the back. We've also pulled out our vanilla because that is an optional add to this recipe. I put vanilla in everything I make. I think it makes the cookies extra tasty. You'll notice we added salt. You almost always want salt in every sweet recipe you make. It brings out the sweetness. And if you're using a really dark chocolate, a little saltiness is pretty good. So the next step is going to be make sure there's nothing on our stove. We don't want to sit on the stove. I always move my cooking spray off the stove because I'm always leery of it getting too hot. Now for this particular recipe, it doesn't matter if your cookie sheet sits on the stove while it's heating. There are some you're not going to want to warm up your cookie sheet with. So keep that in mind. First thing I do is turn the light on to the stove. The reason we want the light on is because we don't want to open and close the stove while our cookies are baking. Once we put our baked item in, we want to open the stove as little as possible. The reason why is every time you open it, you lose temperature. The oven has to come back up to temp. The less you open it, the more appropriate temperature and time your cookies bake, the more perfectly they will bake. We want our rack on the middle. You can do more than one rack. You can do more than one cookie sheet. The ones that are above or below the middle are not going to cook the same as the middle, so I always do them one cookie sheet at a time. So we're going to double check our recipe, make sure we know what we want our temperature at, and this will be 375 degrees. So we're going to turn our stove on. By the time we're done mixing, we should be at temperature. Or by the time we're done putting cookies on the sheet, we should already be at temperature. Our next step is going to be to cream the butter and the sugar. So I've already put the beaters in my hand mixer, and I'm going to go ahead and plug that in. And what we're going to do is cream this till it's light and fluffy. It can take around 3 to 5 minutes, 2 minutes, depends on how soft your butter is. You want to start super low so you don't wear all your sugar. So let's get started. Now, in a stand mixer, you can go ahead, put this on, let it work its magic. You don't have to stand over it. You could be rinsing off measuring cups, prepping other stuff while you're doing it. With a hand mixer, you spend your time doing this. Okay, I'm gonna scrape my bowl, which is something I try to do between every step. It's especially important with stand mixers to always make sure that all your ingredients from the bottom of your bowl are incorporated, because it tends not to reach all the way to the bottom, so you get like flour and sugar that you need to hand incorporate a little. Now I'm clearing my beaters just a bit to make it a little easier for my hand mixer to work. It's not particularly necessary, it just makes it, I think, a little easier. There we go. Now, our next step is going to be to add the egg and the vanilla if you're adding vanilla. So what we're going to do is take our egg. We also never want to crack our egg on the side of the bowl. And if you do like I did and keep your eggs in the bowl, you're going to crack them into. Make sure you rinse your eggs off so in case there was something on the eggshell, it doesn't get into the food. Crack your egg in. If you're like me and sometimes get eggshell in there, now's the time to pull it out. Dump in your egg, and like I said, at this recipe, you don't have to mix the egg all the way in first, but I still like to incorporate them each because then I'm sure that I've got them fully incorporated. Once the one's pretty well mixed in, I go ahead and put the other one in. Get that mixed somewhat, and then we're going to shut off because we want to add our vanilla. Now, as I said, this is an option. I'm probably going to go for a half a tablespoon. I like a little bit more vanilla than most people. For most people, I would recommend a teaspoon to this recipe. Okay, so let's get that vanilla and eggs mixed. All right, now we're going to once again scrape our bowl before we start adding our dry. Now, a lot of recipes that incorporate milk, you'll have wet and dry ingredients. When you have wet and dry ingredients, you're going to start with your dry and do a third, and then you're going to do a half of your wet, then a third of your dry, half of your wet, and finish always on your dry. In this case, it's cookies. We have no wet. We just go ahead and put our flour in. You're going to want to make sure, stand mixer or hand mixer, that you go slow when you start. Now with your stand mixer, you can just turn it on slow and go. Because this is a hand mixer, I'm going to go ahead and give this a quick mix a little bit to get the flour started to incorporate so that we don't shoot flour all over the kitchen. And then I'm going to go ahead and use the mixer to get us our dough. And once the flour starts to incorporate, you can turn off your mixer. Now what I'm going to do is pull the beaters, clean them off, and then I'm going to take my spatula and once again scrape down, scrape the bottom. Because my stand mixer is a lot stronger and this is a thicker dough, it will need a little extra incorporating, more so than say the stand mixer. But you still want to make sure you get that bottom in your stand mixer. Like I said, a lot of times you get some leftover flour, sugar. You want to get that at the bottom. So you want to make sure all that dry is already incorporated into your dough before you start scooping cookies. Then you want to put your beaters out of the way. I always start with this so I don't make myself too filthy. And like I said, remember, we can touch the stuff prior to it going in the oven, so you can use your clean hands to touch this. Now, if you have left your kitchen at some point, if you had to stop and help your child, your dog, use the restroom, check your laundry, whatever else you have going on that day, If you have left your kitchen clean area, you want to wash your hands before you get restarted. When in doubt, always wash your hands when using food. All right, you want to make sure you don't touch your face or your hair, or really even your clothes as much as possible. If you do touch your face or hair, you're going to want to wash your hands. All right, set that beater aside. Let's get this out of our way. Wipe off my finger. Like I said, we're going to make sure we've got every stray bit of flour and sugar that's stuck to the sides or underneath fully mixed in before we go to our next step. All right, now this is what your dough to your cookies should look like. It's a thick, sticky dough. Okay, make sure it's mixed. It should be nice in color. Now, as a rule, I prefer dark brown sugar, so it would be a bit darker than this. What I had was light. We used light. If you have light brown sugar, but you prefer dark brown sugar, and you have molasses, you can add a little molasses to the sugar. That's what makes brown sugar either dark or light, the amount of molasses that's in it. Now we add the chocolate chips. If you're adding nuts or any other ingredient, such as candy pieces or whatever you're adding to your mix at this point, we're gonna do now. So now it says 1 to 2 cups. I'm gonna do about 1.5 because while I love a lot of chocolate chips, you don't want to over chocolate because then it gets a little messy. You can get where it melts out of the cookie, and who wants a chocolate chip cookie that doesn't have a chocolate chip in it? And on that note, you want to mix it well. Make sure you have chocolate chips throughout the whole batter, especially at the bottom, because if you forget the bottom, when you get to the end of scooping your cookies, what happens is you have cookies with no chocolate chips. Now I'm looking at this and I see that I'm a little light on chips for the amount I like to have in my dough. So I'm going to go ahead and sprinkle in a little more and mix them. Now I just checked my oven temp real quick while I'm stirring, and we are about 10 degrees off oven temp. So by the time we are done scooping our first tray of cookies, we will be up to temperature. All right, so let's clean off that. Speaking of up to temperature, there's our beep that tells me my oven has come to temperature. So as soon as I finish filling this tray of cookies, I will be able to put them right in the oven. Oh, let's not lose a chocolate chip. All right, this is where the cooking spray comes in. It's a sticky-ish dough. I want to get all my cookie out and onto my cookie sheet. So I'm going to take my cooking spray, spray it into my cookie scooper. I'm going to move the scoop so that I get it on the scoop too. Then I'm going to take my clean paper towel that I have not used for anything else and just kind of pat it down so it's not wet in there and we don't add any kind of spray to the cookie itself. Now we're going to go ahead and scoop our cookies and get them on our first tray. So you take your scoop, fill it, then I usually take my finger and run it across so that I get a flat thing. Plus I know that means that all my cookies will be that size. Then you want to put them on your tray. And I usually on these trays with these cookies get 3 across, 4 to 5 down depending on the type of cookie. There will be some spread, which is normal. All right, next cookie, and I will show you exactly my positioning, a couple inches apart, a couple finger widths really, and as you can see. Now these are flat bottoms. If you're making a rolled cookie like a snowball where you're actually rolling them into a ball, you're going to want to be very careful when you move them so they don't roll. But I will tell you, if you're using a Silpat, You always want to be very careful when you move your cookies that they don't slide from their position you've put them in, because you put them in the position you want them to cook so that they don't cook together and that you've maximized your space on your cookie sheet. So the first one's always going to be a little slower than filling the next cup cookie sheets you're going to use, because you're figuring out your placement on the first. Now I'm going to get a dozen on this cookie sheet. I probably could squeeze it to 15, but I don't want to take any chances that I end up with the cookies cooked together instead of nice, perfect chocolate chip cookies. Now just keep on going till you have all your cookies. And at this time, you want to make sure your oven's to temperature. You want to make sure you got your rack in the middle. I have forgotten to do that and had to get the pot holders out. And I've had to move my rack before. You want to make sure your light's on, because we don't, again, want to have to open it. We can check the cookie's progress, especially if you're like me and you're nosy and you want to see how they're doing, without opening it. Now it's about a 15-minute bake. I know sometimes my oven runs a little hot. So after I put my cookies in, I'm gonna take my tray, slide it into the oven, set my timer for 13 minutes, and then I'm gonna move on to my next tray of cookies. Now you can go ahead and fill your trays ahead of time and set them aside. At this point, I would not keep my cookie sheets that have cookies on them. Find somewhere else like your table or other counter space to put your cookies on, because you don't want to be heating the dough prior to it going into the oven, because then again it changes the temperature from room temperature to warmer. Alrighty. Like I said, you can see that the second ones go faster. And even I still have to adjust them. Sometimes if you look at your first cookies aren't on and they're not quite right, you can move them. It is a little bit easier to move them with the silk pad or the parchment than if you spray. Also, again, it's so much easier for cleanup with either parchment paper or the silk pad. And if you're using the parchment paper because you don't mind a crispier cookie, if you've got it fitted right and you don't drip anything on your pan, you don't have to wash your pan at all, because nothing will have touched it. And that is a lovely convenience as well. Now you can trust your non-stick pan to not stick. I don't actually have any non-stick cookie sheets. But if you put your non-stick pans in your dishwasher, at some point your non-stick will fail you. While they say they're dishwasher safe, each time you put them in the dishwasher, it does degrade your non-stick coating a little. If I put cooking spray on my non-stick pans, I wash them twice in hot water, because if not, I find that I get a sticky coating to them, which I don't care for. So, alright, see that the second tray went so much quicker than the first. Alrighty. We will be back as soon as cookies are ready to come out of the oven. Okay, it's about time to check our first batch of cookies. About 10 seconds, and now I'm going to take a look and see if they're where I want them to be. If they're not, I've got that 2 minutes of time I didn't put on the timer. Always leave a couple extra minutes from the amount of time it tells you something is to bake, because everybody likes a different level of doneness. Everybody's oven runs a little different. Now we can see, I can look at these and see they're pretty golden brown. And I'll show you everything else I'm talking about as soon as I get them out. I'm going to set them down on my stove for a moment and put our next batch of cookies in. And then I will show you what I'm talking about. Let's get our timer started. Alrighty. You can see these are a little golden brown around the edges. When you give them a little push, they move a little. They're a little firm on top. Now, normally, I would pop these onto my kitchen table because I have a tile top table, so I can put hot things directly on it. But because I'm going to show you about moving your cookies onto there, I'm going to go ahead and put them on some hot pads. Now you'll notice I touched the cookies barehanded after they came out of the oven. These are for my house, so I'm not concerned with touching them, especially because I'm the only one home right now, so I'm the only one that's going to eat them. The other batches of cookies, I'm going to go ahead and put my gloves on when I touch them, simply because I'm going to give some of them away. But the first batch, always for me. And what I've been doing while the original batch of cookies was cooking was putting away all the equipment I don't need anymore, making sure I got out my cookie container to seal them and put them on top of the fridge, and wash all my dishes, clean up my area, and get set for the cooling. I let them cool in the pan for about 5 minutes. If you try to move them fresh out of the oven, they're gonna split, they're gonna break, they're just gonna be a hot mess. In the meantime, I wanted to show you one more thing. You notice we used our spatula. I absolutely prefer silicone. You could use metal, or hard plastic as well. You want to try and avoid the ones with a wooden handle because water and food can get trapped, cause mildew, cause bacteria. Now I've recently moved to using the all one piece, no nooks and cranny spatulas I got from StarPack that I got free to try. But the reason I wanted to use this one is I wanted to show you if you have this kind of rubber spatula that has a handle and a head, they come apart. And when you wash them, you want to make sure you take them apart because you don't want to get mildew, food. You want to make sure the inside's fully dry before you put them back together so you don't trap water in there and grow some mold. And once you separate this, you can take it to the sink and wash it. Alrighty, we're about 3 minutes in, and I'm gonna go ahead and show you what we're gonna do. Now I have a whole glove out for when I move my cookies to the cookie box because my whole hand is gonna touch them. These are latex food safe gloves. If you've ever been into like McDonald's and you've seen the plastic gloves that look like basically a baggie with fingers, you can use those too as long as your hands don't have any cuts, rashes, or anything. Because they're using it as a barrier between you and the food versus protection. I keep these because I double them up to pull sugar. I use a lot of dye when I do fondant, when I'm doing airbrushing. So I always get this kind. But to move my cookies from the pan to the rack, and this is the kind of rack I like to use. It stands up. Mine are stackable, which is great if you're short on space because where you put them to cool, you can stack them straight up. I rarely actually use that feature, but it's good to have. Now I'm going to go ahead and put what we call a finger cut. Well, in this case, it's just a cut off finger from another glove. And I'm gonna go ahead and just cover my finger that's gonna be the helper to moving my cookies. We're around 4 or so minutes in, so I'm gonna go ahead and move my cookies. Still being careful of touching the pan, it is still gonna be hot, okay? Now when I said I was putting things away, I was putting away like the vanilla that stays out until you use it, things like that. My instruments that I washed got put away. One of the good things about pulling all your ingredients prior to baking is once you've sifted out your flour, you put your flour away, you put your sugar away, you put your brown sugar away, everything else that you've used, your salt, your baking soda has been put away before you start baking. So you only have your basic cleanup as your cookies are getting done. So you're gonna take your offset spatula. I never start in the corner. They're hard to reach in the corner. So you don't want to do your first one there. I take my finger that's covered to stabilize, slip my offset spatula in, use my finger to hold the cookie, and put it down without touching it. Now, let's do that again. stabilize, go under. I hold your cookie, use that finger. If you, like me, have trouble not touching things, you can go ahead and do a whole glove. You can do 2 fingers, whatever you're comfortable with. And then we're gonna put these on this rack. Now today I'm in here, so I will be putting them on the kitchen table to cool for a while. Normally, if I need something that's gonna take a long time to cool, like bread, I tend to either put it on top of my fridge, which I make sure I dust every so often, at least once a week, and right before I'm going to put baked goods up there, because I have 2 Siberian Huskies and nothing is safe in your house around Siberian Huskies. So if I have to leave the kitchen area, or I know I'm going to have to leave the kitchen area, what I do is put my racks of cookies in my office and close the door. Now, again, I have a table I can put hot things on. This is almost cool enough to really touch and pick up. The only thing I have to rinse off is my Silpat. Now, the thing about Silpats, if you get them, is you don't want to bend them. You want to wash them, lay them flat, you want to store them flat, or in a very loose roll. If you start to see ripping within the fibers, it's not going to be as non-stick. When one gets old, I use it for pulling sugar because it makes it easier. So because I'm working in a smaller space right now to show y'all, I'm going to go ahead and just move this over to my oven. These are not super giant, super thick cookies. They'll cool pretty quickly. Once they're fully cool, you can move them to your thing. As you can see, using our cookie scoop, they're almost all identical. They flattened out. None of them were sticking together. And they're all about the same size. So especially if you're gifting the cookies around Christmas, birthdays, Valentine's Day, being able to get your cookies almost exactly the same size is beautiful. All right, I'll be back with y'all as soon as we're ready to put cookies in the container. Okay, with most of our cookies out, we can start by packing our cookies, the ones for the house, and one of the treat boxes that I have. As I said, some of the ones that I was making are going to someone else. I've got these cute little treat boxes. And there I went, almost touching that with my bare hand, even after I told y'all we want a glove after we're done. But I caught myself. So you take your gloved hand and you load up treat box, treat bag, if you're taking them to work, your container. This particular one I'm going to put probably a half dozen. Now you'll see, or I should say, I got a full 3 dozen cookies out of that recipe. That's your norm. If it's super wet out and your flour is absorbing more moisture out of the air, you may get more. If it's super dry, you may get a little less. If you put more chocolate chips, less chips, a lot of things. So it will vary the size of your cookie scoop, although they're pretty even, all the cookie scoops. All right, so we've got our treat boxes packed up. And then I'm gonna go ahead and take these ones, and you're gonna take your container and you're just gonna load them in, and you're gonna wanna make sure your cookies are 100% cooled. Like I said, these are not huge cookies. They don't take that long, especially with this type of rack that I have. Now, the reason I like this particular rack is, again, they're stackable, but the reason you take them out of the pan to finish cooling after 5 minutes is they cool a lot quicker on an open rack. If you have a rack like this one that stands up off the ground, they'll cool even quicker because they're getting cooling air top and bottom. Then I'm gonna set these aside because I have another 3 dozen still in the oven. So there it is, Cookie 101, how to make them, what you need, how to do it. And that'll be it for this particular video. The next video is gonna be dog biscuits, strawberry banana with some peanut butter, my dog's favorite. I will give you alternate recipes for that as well, and show you how to make the dog biscuits, how to know safe to look up whether ingredients are safe or not, and how to store them. So if you have any comments, please drop them in the bottom. And if you have any questions, also please drop them in the bottom. I will try and get to them as quickly as possible. Also, if anyone has any requests for a new video, let me know what you want to make. Thank you for joining me for this video.